December 4th, 1991. The Intelligence Division of the Spanish Air Force compiles this: a list of 55 fenómenos extraños, strange phenomena. Of those, just 4 were classified A cases, getting the most thorough analysis. The first came in 1976 when a transparent sphere with red figures inside hovered above the Canary Islands. Our video on that is linked below. The second of these A cases is even more unbelievable. In 1977, a carpenter, Juan Sillero, says a 20-meter-wide saucer landed near his home outside Gallarta. He told investigators a craft came 4 other times, one of which he went on board and interacted with beings that looked human. The file states the witness was told telepathically the beings were there to help Earth because it was going out of its orbit and tilting too much. After the craft left, on 2 different occasions, Juan heard fighter jets overhead. How legitimate is this encounter? And what did the Air Force conclude? We cover strange declassified files. Subscribe to join us. Gallarta sits on Spain's northern coast, between Bilbao and the Atlantic Ocean. 2 kilometers to the south was where Juan, his wife, and several children lived, on the edge of a pine forest near Mount Triano. He built furniture for a living and was described as a sober, simple guy by his neighbors. His life became more complicated on February 10, 1977. At 3 a.m, he was woken up by the sound of his animals outside. As if hypnotized, he told the investigator, he left his house, crossed a small forest, and reached a clearing. In it was a saucer humming and rocking. As it landed on legs, he said, 2 beings, each 2 meters tall, descended, wearing overalls. They saw him and told him not to be afraid. They had to leave because they had been detected. 10 nights later, he was awoken again. He says he went to the same spot, where a slightly different-looking saucer landed after a few attempts. 2 beings came out and told him they wanted to help Earth, which was in great danger because it was tilting too much and would go out of orbit. He does not understand what they mean by this, the investigator wrote. After their conversation, the saucer took off at unbelievable speed. In a dome atop the craft, Juan saw silhouettes like people gesturing exaggeratedly with their arms. Landing number 3, a week later. The same disk as number 2 touched down in the early morning and lowered a tank-like object into the ground as if it were taking samples. On the dome was something like an eye, which seemed to be scanning the area with a ray of light. As he hid, Juan says he was unable to move due to a strange force. A sweet smell eventually filled the air, and a thought entered his mind. Come down, closer to the ship. He went to the disk, and a walkway like a telescope extended. Juan entered. Once inside, it was illuminated by its entire surface. The center of the dome featured a circular table with multicolored lights, he claimed. Beings sat around it, encircling a ball of red color that was not lit yet, he said. The walls around them had screens like television. They looked human, but strangely, Juan noticed they paid him no mind, and to him only seemed to be grunting to each other and moving their hands, again in an exaggerated way. Finally, one he called the boss held out his hand, which was cold to the touch. Next to him was a woman, and as he noticed her chest, the 2 beings laughed. Juan assumed they were reading his thoughts. They began to tell him how their women were similar to those on Earth, when Juan claimed the red ball in the center lit up, and they told him planes were approaching. As Juan left the ship, its lights grew bright, and it departed toward the ocean to the north. Jets from the east followed it. How reliable is Juan? We'll get there. Let's finish his story first. Next, he told the Air Force he was visited 2 final times. The 4th came in March, but he didn't remember anything extraordinary. In April, it came for a 5th time, he says, when he was watching TV. Juan ventured out to the clearing to meet it, and 3 beings came out, telling him they were again in a hurry because they had been detected by radar. Here's the first inconsistency. Ufologists reported Juan told them more about the last 2 visits. The 4th, according to them, came after the saucer approached within feet of his house. He entered once it landed and asked for a souvenir. He received this during the 5th encounter when they purportedly gave him a stone that dazzles everyone who looked at it except him. Again, how reliable is Juan? The Air Force investigator writes, "From the statements of the witness, it seems to be deduced that, indeed, a flying object was observed that could not identify with any type of airplane, helicopter, or balloon. Meteorological reports showed visibility was greater than 10 kilometers those nights, and there was no lightning. The shape of the object does not resemble any known aircraft," they wrote. Juan's physical and mental state gave credit, he said, to his claims. Quote, "Despite the fantastic tone, no contradictions were heard." Ufologists at STENDEK, whose report is also in the file, generally agreed. We asked his neighbors for their opinion. They all told us he was a totally normal and balanced person. On another occasion, to test if he would lie, they told him something false. "Hey Juan," they said, 10 days ago newspapers reported a triangle-shaped UFO here." With no hesitation, he replied, "That's a lie. All ships are the same. I saw them well." But they did find some issues. The Air Force investigator writes, "Without being able to present any conclusive evidence to confirm them, the sightings must be attributed to his imagination." STENDEK specifically took issue with Juan's son-in-law, Jose, a naval engineer and fervent believer in extraterrestrials. Jose claimed he knew UFO propulsion systems used magnetic fields, and that he was sharing what he knew with the Soviet Union. When asked for proof, he refused. While Juan may not have been a believer, Jose's influence could have affected what he told officials. Strangely, in the case file, the government doesn't appear to have interviewed his wife. Ufologists later write she wasn't interested in talking about her husband's sightings, though they speculate it could have been out of fear. At least once, files show Juan warned others not to talk about the beings because they told him bad things would happen to those who did. We have a lot of questions. Why didn't the investigator check if jets were scrambled? What about radar data? And why did the Air Force choose to spend so much time on this case, out in the middle of nowhere, involving a carpenter? STENDEK's conclusions in the government file were also written differently than their own publication. For officials, they seemingly didn't reach a conclusion, only mentioning Jose's troubling influence. In a magazine in 1978, though, their lead investigator concluded Juan never imposed his narrative on us, always limiting himself to answering the questions asked. What about what the beings apparently told him? That Earth was tilting too much. In 1993, French scientists wrote a peer-reviewed paper that suggested without the moon, Earth could leave its stable axial tilt zone of 22 to 24 degrees and tilt up to 85 degrees. If this happens, complex life would likely cease to exist, though it would probably take millions of years. Eventually, hemispheres would have 3 months of total darkness and 3 months of total light. NASA discovered the Earth's axis began moving east in 2000 at 6 inches per year. This, they say, is due to mass redistribution from Greenland ice melt, rising land as glaciers thin, and convection in the mantle. There's no data that suggests axial tilt will ever leave its stable zone, though, and as long as we have the moon, we shouldn't ever reach the doomsday scenario. But one wonders why Juan would add such a benign detail to his story. He told investigators he wasn't even sure what it meant. We have other questions, too. Were the grunts Juan says he heard on board due to him observing telepathy, without being a recipient of it? And what was the red ball in the center of the craft that alerted them to jets? JJ Benitez, a local journalist, wrote the article that got the Air Force interested in the case. He even gave Juan's address to investigators. When the chief of the 3rd Air Region, Carlos Cavero, died, Benitez published a letter he received from him. Throughout those months, it wrote, "Our radar station Siesta observed 5 unidentified echoes. Some perform maneuvers not possible for aircraft in the area of Gallarta. At least 2 scrambles occurred," he claimed, of F-4 Phantoms to intercept the echoes. Declassified files do not include this information, and we cannot confirm it. But the Air Force seemed to trust Benitez. Copies of 12 different cases, classified at the time, were given to him in 1976 to investigate. There's the more obvious question, too. Might military involvement have been why the Air Force felt compelled to make Juan's encounter one of the only cases that ever received a full investigation? There were other Benitez stories that didn't get resources, such as reports of soldiers shooting a luminous humanoid outside an airbase in '76. Did they believe Juan's story was more legitimate? Of course, the issues remain. Juan's accounts were consistent across all retellings, but we never got strong confirmation from his wife. His son-in-law's interest in UFOs doesn't prove Juan fabricated the story, but it is curious. Jose's mention of USSR interest in Spanish UFO research sounds fantastic, but it's worth wondering if there really were Soviet analysts attempting to gather information about sightings in the 70s. We already know that the USSR had at least one special project, Thread 3, to analyze how UFOs worked. Jose, an engineer, publicly stating his knowledge of them, may have been a target. More significantly, STENDEK wrote markings in the ground Juan believed could have come from the craft were actually from a local mining company. They surveyed mining truck drivers who operated near his home 24/7. None witnessed anything abnormal in the sky. But Juan never emphasized the markings to a significant degree to investigators. Is it possible he was just wrong about the trace evidence, but still telling the truth? The last file in the record comes in '79, when the Air Force states they don't know if the case is open or not. There are reasons to doubt Juan. But there are also reasons to doubt Juan's incentive to make any of this up. He never attempted to monetize the encounter, and his neighbors and investigators generally believed him, even if he had no concrete evidence. We can't help but wonder if we're getting the full investigation here. 2 years earlier, radar operators at Badajoz saw 8 anomalous radar echoes above 25,000 feet. They were changing speeds as if a commercial plane suddenly reached the velocity of a fighter. Those were never explained. So, where is the accompanying radar data for Juan's sighting? If it would have shown no activity, one would assume it would have been included proudly in the file. But that's not the case. In fact, a whistleblower claims radar data may explain why the Air Force investigated Juan in the first place. Do you believe Juan? Let us know in the comments. Special thank you to our Patreon supporters, including John T. We can't do this without you guys. If you like what we do, consider joining them on Patreon and help us produce one new episode every week. Thanks again. See you next time.